Okay, this is a tutorial on how to practice and learn soldering using the HackBerry solder trainer. So you're going to need a couple things to get this done. The first thing is you'll need a solder trainer board. We've got 4 just kind of whatever resistors and 2 sets of normal header pins and then 2 sets of some really small header pins to practice some fine pitch soldering. Some of the other tools that you will need for this are going to be a soldering iron, some solder, a set of good snips, a solder sucker, but hopefully we won't need that, so that's only if you make mistakes, and then a little piece of painter's tape for helping hold components in place, and then one of these little brass sponges for cleaning the tip of your soldering iron. So to get started, we want to kind of figure out which components to solder first, and it's always good to go with components that are going to kind of sit the lowest on the board. If you attach something that kind of like pokes way up, it's harder to get the components to stay in place as you are putting them in. And so I'm actually going to start with the resistors. Now with these resistors, I'm going to go ahead and bend these leads and feed them in. Okay, and I'm going to do one at first. As you get the hang of it, you can do more than one at a time, but it's good if you're just haven't soldered for a while or if you're kind of getting used to it, just to go one at a time. Okay, so I've got my soldering iron on, and I'm going to go ahead and clean the tip and put some fresh solder on it. And so to do this, we're going to apply the tip just to the very base. There's this little ring right here with a pin coming through it, and we want to make sure that that entire ring gets covered with solder to make sure that there's a good strong connection to this pin. So I'm going to place the soldering tip at the bottom. I'm going to apply a little solder into that joint, and we'll take a close look at that in just a second, but you can see that it's filled up that entire ring. Now we don't want it to accidentally touch this other solder pad right here. So soldering is all about kind of making connections that should be made and not making connections that shouldn't, and so we only want that solder to be on that one ring. If that branches over, we'll kind of talk about how to clean that up, but we want to keep it just to that one solder pad. And so we can do that over on here as well. And I'm going to clean my tip. Okay. And we've got some good solder joints. You can see they're kind of nice and symmetrical. They should look like little silver volcanoes. And at this point, I'm going to snip away those leads as close to the base as you can. You can see we still got the little silver volcanoes there, but those little leads are gone. And we've got a good solid solder joint. So we're going to go ahead and put in the rest of these resistors. Flip them over. Okay. And if you are having troubles getting them to stay in place, then you can put a piece of tape over them. So I'm going to get these resistors put in and then put a piece of tape just to hold them in place so they don't all fall out when I flip it over. Putting that one in. Oops, see, this one already popped out, so that tape is going to really help. Okay, so I'm going to take my piece of tape and just put that on top and press down. Okay, and now we're ready to solder again. So we can just go pad by pad. And if you need to get a better angle on your work, it's okay to flip it around. Okay. So these should be okay mostly. So this one right here, you can see that it doesn't have very much solder on it. And so we want to look out for those. We want to make sure, again, it's got that nice little volcano of solder. So we can just add just a little bit more to that. And that's going to make a much stronger joint. You can sometimes get things not working right, and it comes back to not having a really strong solder joint. Okay, so, all right, so we've got those all soldered up. Now, we had talked about kind of what happens if for some reason these were to blob together, so I'm going to kind of simulate that. I'm just going to add a whole bunch of solder. Okay. So we can see on this one, so these should be 2 separate pads, but they've kind of connected to each other, and that's bad. And this is actually pretty easy to fix. What you can do is clean your solder tip a little bit. And if you just kind of wipe the solder tip through it, it's actually going to remove some of that solder. Okay, and if you do that enough, you can see, I'm just going to touch these back up, you can see that they're two different solder joints again. So if as you're kind of working with these, if you do get two tips accidentally touching, then you can kind of just do that little wipe trick to try to remove some of that solder from that joint. If it gets really bad, you can use the solder sucker. So you can push on this, and then when the solder is heated up, you can press the button and it'll suck that solder up. But for small stuff like that, it can be easy just to wipe it away. Okay, so we've got our resistors in. They're looking good. They're relatively flat to the edge, which is nice. And so next we're going to do our next kind of tallest component, which I think are going to be these little components here. And these are really tricky, mostly because they are really, really close to each other. It's really easy to accidentally solder these pins together, and we very much do not want to do that. So this is the one that's probably going to take the most practice. So I'm going to put my piece of tape in there, and actually I let the little pins kind of poke out through the top, and that's okay, because I just want it to hold in place. Okay, and so with these, what I like to do is I like to work my way from either the inside out, or if I have really long pins here, and I'll show you on the other one, you can solder the outside ones and then trim everything short, and that makes it a little bit easier to not solder things together. But I'll show you this one first where I've got short pins. I'm just going to come in here and just add a little bit of solder to each of these pins. Okay, just doesn't take a lot for those. You can just see how much smaller those are compared to these big ones. Okay, so in that case, you can see that that's held in pretty nicely, and that we've got some nice small little solder joints. And you can inspect these with a microscope if you want, to make sure that they are all connected. So the next way that I'm going to show you is if for some reason you have long pins, maybe let's say you've got a really long LED that you have to put through. In fact, let me see. Yeah, so maybe you've got something like this where there's just these really long pins, and I'm going to show you with this one how this can work sometimes. Okay, so you've got your LED, and if you try to do these small little pins, it can be really easy to kind of accidentally solder all of them together. And so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to just solder one of these pins in place. Okay, yeah, so that one's soldered in place. And getting into these small little cracks without touching the other pins can be tricky. And so at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim them all pretty short. Okay, notice I pointed that away from my face. And at this point, I've got much smaller pins that I can come in and solder. And so I'm going to come in, and I'm just going to kind of walk right down the line here. And I'm going to solder that one. Again, just applying just a small bit of solder. Okay. And so again, just very distinct, no big blobs there. And again, that trick of kind of trimming the leads short is good if you, for some reason, have like some really long LEDs that just solder in one pin, trim them off, and then kind of solder in the rest, and that will keep all these little bits from getting in the way of your soldering iron. Okay. Last couple bits are these just long header pins, and so these are going to go in like this. So, okay. And again, nice thing about the tape is it's going to help keep those nice and upright. And you want to make sure that these are as straight as possible, so that whatever you're plugging into isn't going to be at an angle. And just like we did before, just kind of coming right down the edge. And you can use helping hands to kind of hold these in place if you want. If you feel comfortable just doing it on a regular surface, then that's perfectly okay. So sometimes the helping hands will keep it from moving around too much on you. Okay. And so again, just making these small little solder joints along the way. And you don't want to keep the soldering iron on there too long, because you can sometimes melt components, or heat them up too much. So clean that tape. Okay. And we'll kind of inspect our work. Okay. And everything looks pretty good. So that is a completed solder trainer. So again, as you kind of go through, you just want to inspect each of these, make sure you didn't miss any, make sure that each one has a good solid solder joint and that those solder rings or solder pads are completely covered with solder and that you don't have any pins that are accidentally connecting. Sometimes that can fry components on a board and that can get pretty expensive. So you just want to make sure that as you go through that you inspect them closely and that you don't have anything that's touching that shouldn't be touching. And that's it.